In case you haven't noticed, I've been dropping not very subtle hints in my latest videos that I've gotten really into combat sports lately, especially MMA and boxing. And while I know this is generally a movie channel, I really want this channel to be for talking about entertainment in general, whether that's superhero movies, movies in general, TV, YouTube, or sometimes this kind of thing. I also want this channel to be for me to talk about things that I'm passionate about, and I'm not gonna lie, I really want to make a video on this stuff. So, even if you're here for the movie stuff, I think you'll still enjoy this video, because I'm not going to be analyzing the technique of the sport, really. I want to talk about what makes MMA amazing as a form of entertainment, specifically the UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, for those who don't know. I think a huge part of what has people invested in combat sports is the people involved and their stories, and so this is going to be more about the entertainment side and less the technical side, which as someone who got into MMA about 10 months ago, I feel I'm probably not well enough versed in yet to speak on with proper authority. So, let's get into it. There are two main elements that make the sport of MMA, and specifically the biggest promotion, the UFC, as entertaining as it is: the fighting and the fighters. So I want to go through both of those, as well as some smaller points that also play a part. Also, for the record, a lot of what I'm about to say could also apply to boxing, but I will be using the UFC as the main example here. Firstly, the fighters. I don't actually watch a ton of other sports as often as I do fighting, so I'm not sure if this is the case with many other sports, but even if it is, I feel like it's more prevalent in fighting. But the character of the fighters, their personalities, their stories, is a huge part of the sport. Through press conferences, interviews, and videos specifically designed to tell their stories and let you in on more of their lives, more on that later, these fighters have their personalities developed so the fans can see them and are built up almost like characters in a movie. Except this is real life. A lot of fighters have great stories too, and their personalities make them interesting, like Michael Bisping's rise through adversity, or Donald Cerrone's badass cowboy lifestyle, or Jorge Masvidal's journey from the streets and BMF attitude.
It was super necessary.
Or Dustin Poirier, or Israel Adesanya, or Rose Namajunas, or Khabib, or Stipe, or Francis, or Derek Lewis, and so on, with the fighter most known for his story and personality definitely being Conor McGregor. So when these fighters that you care about step in the octagon, it makes it that much more exciting to watch. Not just that you enjoy watching the sport, or that you're rooting for the guy from your country, but that you feel like you know these people, and you like one or both of them. Which is also what makes that feeling of victory so sweet and emotional when someone you're rooting for wins. And then that leads to the crossover element of the sport, which to be honest reminds me a bit of the Marvel Cinematic Universe in a funny way. There are multiple elements to the crossover. There are the actual fighting styles that cross over and can make interesting or epic fights. Styles make fights, as the saying goes. And then also the crossover of stories, of personalities. You get to see personalities clash at press conferences, and in the build-ups to fights. And if you've gotten to know these fighters' stories over the years, seeing them go against each other can be even more exciting. Like for example with Gaethje vs Ferguson. Not only an exciting style matchup, but we've seen the rise of both for years, so seeing them clash is really exciting. Or same thing goes for Khabib and Gaethje coming up, or Whittaker until recently, or any number of other great matchups of fighters you've watched the rise of, and feel like you know, and then both of them going at each other. The weight divisions almost seem like their own separate stories, like each one has its own kind of dynamic and feel. And then these different sections also cross over, with fighters moving up and down. The storylines leading into fights can also be very engaging based on the personalities involved. Whether it's a generally unlikable fighter fighting someone you like, so you want to see that fighter you dislike lose, or your fighter win, or it's a heated grudge match with a deep personal disdain or rivalry, like Khabib and Conor, or Cody and TJ, or Masvidal and Askren, or Cormier and Jones, and so on. Or if it's to see who's the best, like with Stipe and DC, or a well-liked underdog fighter finally getting to fight for the title, or even a fight to see who earns the next shot at the title. There's oftentimes a very compelling narrative around a fight one way or another. And yeah, like I mentioned, rivalries are a big part of building a hype in the sport. Some other great ones include Silva and Sonnen, Conor and Diaz, and coming up soon, Israel and Costa. The way fighters are also built up in certain ways, a great example being Francis Ngannou, helps to build up hype. Ngannou being such a powerful puncher and so terrifying in his fights makes a fight with Stipe almost like a Rocky movie. Can Stipe with skill beat the hardest hitter on the planet? The humor from certain fighters also helps to build fights, whether it's more wholesome humor, like Stipe or Wonderboy, or something along the lines of Masvidal and Conor. It does help to make fights more entertaining. Again, all these fighters almost feel like characters in a movie or show sometimes. I know the idea of trash talk is a bit divisive. I definitely also enjoy seeing the fighters have more of a respectful build-up to the fight sometimes as well, but it's hard to deny that trash talk doesn't make fights exciting.
I know that I'm better than this.
Sounds like the worst self-help book you've ever read. Conceive, believe, achieve. Shut the fuck up.
With someone talking lots of trash beforehand, either you find it entertaining and or you want to see them win, or you find it very irritating or disrespectful and you want to see them get humbled. Humbled being a nice way of putting it. Either way, you're watching the fights and are invested in them. In some fights, the fighters kind of fall into a hero and villain role. And then let's talk about the sport itself, which is the other part that makes the UFC so entertaining. A lot of combat sports are like this, but mixed martial arts is a very brutal sport, which is what turns a lot of people away from it. But it's not just meaningless violence like some people think it is. A, there's the skill element to it, which we'll get to in a bit, but B, it's also a very primal thing, fighting until one of you is victorious. There's something powerful about that. The respect and the glory that comes with defeating someone else in combat. And then there is also that brutalness of the sport, which admittedly does make it more entertaining. To a certain extent of brutalness, obviously. But you can see that with how big the BMF fight was. That was literally built on and marketed as just being a raw, brutal, all-out fight. It raises the stakes immensely, and there are real consequences for the sport, which makes you respect those who step into the sport even more. After the Hooker-Poirier fight, there was a video released which was quite out of the ordinary for the UFC, showing more how dark the aftermath was for Hooker. I know they do that to a certain extent with the Thrill and Agony series, but this was more dark and raw than usual. And again, it shows how you have to respect the fighters. They're risking it all to be the best, to entertain, to provide for their families, whatever it is. And speaking of Poirier, the way after the Holloway fight, he said he's earned the interim belt in blood, paid in full.
I've got knocked down, I've climbed back up, like I said before, man, this is my belt, I earned this in blood, I paid in full, this is mine.
It's a sport where you can see people really have to dig deep and literally fight their way to their goals. And to me, there's something very powerful and inspiring about that. The skill of it also is so interesting, because there's lots of analysis that can then be done regarding technique and matchups of different styles, and just the absolute athleticism that's needed to be a UFC champion is insane. Think about, you have to be extremely fit, just generally, then have to have the reflexes and skills to fight well, the fight IQ to pick your shots correctly, and the composure to perform on the big stage. Oh, and also, someone else is in that octagon trying to punch you in the face at the same time. It's an insanely tough sport. Again, creating more respect for the fighters. Plus, there's the element of surprise in fighting. Anything can change with one punch, so while you can definitely make estimated guesses about fights, you can never truly know exactly how it'll turn out. There can be huge upsets, absolute wars, or sometimes that works out for the worst, and a fight that you thought would be awesome turns out to suck. But regardless, I know that's the case with most sports, but in fighting especially, where something can change like that, and in such a visceral way and personal way, not knowing really makes the build-up even more exciting. Like if a football or basketball team gets upset, it's not the same feeling as a fighter suddenly getting knocked out, you know? Now, some smaller things that are also more specific to the UFC, and not just MMA in general. I think the fact that they have Dana White in charge helps a lot, whether you like him or not, and I definitely do not agree with some of the stuff he says. Having one very distinct figurehead as the leader of the organization helps to tie the whole UFC together. He's like the Kevin Feige of the UFC, if you want to think about it like that. Even though there's so many avenues to go down in this organization, and so many aspects to it, there is one overall person leading it, which helps to tie it all together. Plus, again, love him or hate him, he's certainly a personality. At the very least, he gives fans something to talk about. I also think the UFC's marketing team deserves a lot of respect, because, yeah, the UFC has lots of interesting fighters with great stories or personalities, but that doesn't really matter if no one can find out about them. From their really well-edited previews that get you excited for fights, to the embedded series and countdowns that give you more of an insight into the fighters' lives, to big press conferences with lots of huge stars, to the Thrill and Agony videos giving more in-depth looks at the fights, to the Ultimate Fighter show, which builds up rising stars and gives them a platform to present their skills and their personalities, to those cold opens narrated by Ron Perlman. I mean, come on, listen to this part from the Conor Cowboy cold open and tell me that doesn't make you at least a bit excited for this fight.
To a shattered record, the all-time leader in wins. Upon record, the all-time leader in finishes. And traded blows with a murderer's row for a decade. The legendary Cowboy. A fabled gunslinger who through 33 UFC bouts has made the fighter's slogan a way of life.
Basically, my point is, I think the UFC does an excellent job of marketing their athletes' personalities and stories, and do it better than a lot of other combat sports and sports in general. Like boxing, for example, I think could learn a lot from how the UFC does its marketing. Although, to be fair, there have been some similar moves towards this sort of thing, but not to the extent that the UFC does it. And there are also videos like the Fight Motion ones that are just cool additions to the fights. Also, and again, I realize there's probably an element of this to lots of sports, but the community around MMA and MMA fans, yes, alright, oftentimes there's lots of unpleasantness and arguments and people being salty and all that, but the sense of humor of the MMA community and the inside jokes that build up around fighters makes it even more fun to watch. You just need to look at the Tony Ferguson jokes, or the comments of any Joe Rogan MMA podcast, or Chael Sonnen's videos, or the Mojahed Fudela YouTube channel to see what I mean. By the way, that is absolutely one of my favorite YouTube channels. If you like MMA or the UFC and you don't watch Mojahed, firstly, I don't think that'll apply to a lot of people, but if you don't, go subscribe right now. Some very, very funny and creative short animated skits about UFC fights and UFC news and boxing as well and all that. It's an excellent channel. Also, if we're talking about great MMA channels, Dreist Studios makes fantastic UFC promos and videos as well. Also, yeah, speaking of Joe Rogan's involvement in the MMA world definitely helps.
Perfect!
He's a great commentator, and his podcast provides more of a mainstream platform for discussion of MMA topics. And the other UFC analysts and shows discussing it help to create this web of entertainment and interesting discourse surrounding the fights. Also, John Anik, another great commentator. Him and Joe are my favorites, just putting that out there. Also, on another note, Bruce Buffer's voice is awesome. I don't know where to put that in the video, so I'll just drop it in here. I also think him and his brother are perfect for the sports they're in. Michael Buffer's voice is awesome, but it's also more, classy, which fits boxing more, as that's seen by many to be a classier sport than MMA. You know, it's a gentleman's sport, an older sport, while Bruce Buffer's voice is more wild and intense, like MMA. So, overall, the UFC is so entertaining because it's almost like its own cinematic universe. There are tons of different stories and characters shooting off from different directions to be interested in, and they then cross over in main events of very entertaining competition. Add on top of that the promotion and content spinning off from these fights, and it creates an incredibly captivating sporting organization. And again, lots of these things can apply to boxing and other MMA promotions, but I don't think it's an unpopular opinion that the UFC is the MMA organization that does it the best. Also, if you guys like this video and are interested in this kind of thing, I'd really like to make more videos about the UFC and fighting and fighters and boxing, especially the entertainment and story side of it as well. Fighter stories, previews of upcoming fights, I don't know. I'm still staying with movies and TV stuff, don't worry, but I do want to expand my channel a bit to include entertainment in general. So yeah, let me know if you want to see more of this in the comments. So, those are my thoughts on the UFC. Do you watch it? And if so, which of the upcoming fights of the next couple of months are you most excited for? Let me know all of your thoughts down below in the comments. While you're at it, be sure to like this video, check out my Instagram and Twitter at BHL_Hudson, check out this podcast about movies and TV I do with a friend of mine called The Poorly Planned Podcast, and subscribe for more videos like the one you just watched. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.